There we go. Can you hear me now? Awesome. It's a new year. It was a good Christmas. So I'll start with a statement of acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge this land that we meet on today as the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. Okay, so we'll go to the item 2 is the attendance record. I believe everybody's here. We've got no apologies, no motions to grant a leave of absence, and no leave of absence, and no non-attendance. All right. Item 3 is the declarations of interests. Does anyone need to declare any interest with any of the agenda items for tonight? No, pretty straightforward. Item 4 is to confirm the minutes from our last meeting, which seems a very long time ago, on the 7th of November 2023. Would someone like to move that? Mayor Redmond. Seconder is Christine. All in favour? Carried unanimously. And item 5 is the business arising from the minutes. I have no business arising from the minutes. Okay. Easy. All right, we'll go on to item 6, which is the decision reports. So the first item, 6.1, is the FY24 mid-year budget review. Now, Sharon, would you like to speak to this, or Erin?
I'll start off. Take the report as being read. So obviously, since the first budget update, there has been a bit of a deterioration in the forecasted operating result. The main factors, I suppose the predominant factors in relation to that is obviously the impact of our increase in interest rates on our interest costs. So there has been the budget was set based on around 5% interest, and now it's currently up around 6.15. So that has had an impact. And obviously the other one was depreciation, where we ended up in the end of last financial year with a higher depreciation expense than we anticipated, which was higher than what we'd actually budgeted for this year. And the other third factor was basically and come down to, I suppose, an error in developing the budget, and there's some confusion in relation to the cost of electricity with the way it was changed because of the LED project. So the maintenance component of the streetlights previously was part of the tariff. However, when the budget was presented, was established, the maintenance component was actually missed out of that because of the way the ownership structure had actually changed. So staff have gone through and tried to minimise, I suppose, as much as the impact as we can. However, there's still obviously some work to do to bring that back in and trying to recover some of that stuff as we go through the next 6 months of the year. So I'll take any questions.
Yep. Are there any questions? Thanks, Sharon. Councillor Koch.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just through to Sharon, with the LED lights, there was a figure there of our savings, so that savings now less. I'm just wondering whether the maintenance is actual maintenance or whether it's just like a contract that they do, because the LEDs actually have less maintenance than the previous bulbs.
Yes, yeah, but effectively in the calculation, so when the budget was developed, it was just based on the usage, effectively. So the usage cost of the electricity without actually having a maintenance component. So yes, there's less maintenance costs associated with that, but there is still some maintenance that actually needs to be paid, undertaken associated with the LED lights or the street lighting. And that was just omitted because obviously we took over the ownership of the street lights, and I suppose even though we take ownership of it, there is still some maintenance, which is actually just was omitted.
Yep, Mayor Redmond.
How much is the street lighting costing us?
I'll have to take that question on notice because I don't have that information at hand. Or just to clarify, how much is the maintenance associated component of it, or yeah, I have to take that.
I need the entire cost of street lighting and whether the LED lights actually saved us money and whether it's an extra cost now to council. The holistic cost. I want the whole of the cost of street lighting, and we were told we were going to save money with LED lights. I don't think we have, and I think that's unfortunate.
Yep.
I think that overall our budget total, that what we'd actually included in the budget for this year, probably wouldn't have been any less than the previous year. However, the savings that we've actually incurred was we withheld the impact of the increase in the electricity tariff. So if we didn't have LED lighting, our electricity cost would be far significant than what they are today. We may not have saved anything from a 22-23 to 23-24 budget, but we've actually avoided probably a couple of $100,000 in increased cost, but we can actually provide that information back to you. I would say that we probably saved more than $75,000, but we can take that question on notice and provide it back to the committee.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Peter. Just pop your microphone on.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I guess my question is really, since the original budget was put in place, has it been a deterioration of around about $900,000? It's almost doubled the deficit that we started with, and I just wondered whether there's any further work being done or consideration being given to other areas that might be able to be examined to reduce the deficit in the current financial year, as opposed to just accepting it goes up.
Oops. Sharon.
Yep, there's been lots of consideration and lots of discussions that have actually been had at a management level. Just before, just after Christmas, obviously once the result came, I suppose, to fruition, there was a discussion at an executive level, and there has been this position of basically everyone's been told to go back and look at their budgets, and basically from a third budget review, effectively we need to actually identify more further savings to actually bring that back, and that also applies to the increased scrutiny that's actually currently being applied to the recurrent budget for 24-25, because obviously some of the costs, while we can minimise and reduce, some of the impacts, like obviously with the interest costs, yes, we can try and reduce that. The only way we're actually going to reduce that is reducing spend, because effectively that's, and to try and bring our borrowing level down, and so that is effectively a reduction in expenditure that we're going to have to actually look at, and how we can actually do that and minimise that. And obviously there's a paper further in about some options to take advantage of minimising some of the interest rates, given that the fixed interest is now getting predicted reductions are now getting built into the fixed interest price. So there's little things, but again, from a discussion that we had probably 3 weeks ago with the executive team and some of the key managers present at that time, it was pretty much a thing of looking back at your expenses. What are you doing? What's in there? What won't be done? What doesn't need to be done? Are we, is there areas of over-servicing or potential expenditure that we don't necessarily need to do to actually try and bring that back? Because I suppose your concern is exactly the same as my concern, because effectively this is going to flow into 24-25, and we can't actually have that flowing into 24-25 budget as well, because it doesn't. It's just basically accumulation from that perspective as well. So we have been looking at it. We don't have the answer, but the emphasis on and the messaging that's been going out to managers is start looking and start understanding and start knowing where your costs are getting driven from and what can we forego.
Thanks. Oh, sorry.
Follow up on that in terms of the expectations around interest rates, which we all think have probably peaked and maybe due to come down, but it's not guaranteed. And in fact, it seems like the Reserve Bank will probably hold interest rates at a higher level than longer than maybe we've expected. And also, the Governor today said that we're living in a very unstable world and anything could happen, and she was emphasising the point that it's not over yet, so I need to just bear that in mind, I guess.
Councillor Kosh. Sorry, Christine.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. On page 9 of 89, the major initiatives at the top there talks about the biodiversity plan projects. I think the council staff have been made aware of a grant that closes on the 13th, which directly links to the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. And from my understanding, that grant is 100% funded, it's federal, so I'm just wondering whether council is going to follow up on that. Because in here it says that we're not going to do anything, but from my understanding there is a grant opportunity out there.
Through the Chair, I can take this one. We are actively preparing a grant submission for that grant round. We've got a couple of different projects, not just in the biodiversity plan, but in stormwater and erosion control that we're going to we're building in to make it quite a compelling grant application. I'll provide an update to that at IES next week.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, sorry, Christine.
Just a more general question. I'm just wondering, did a representative from the LGFA visit the council to explain the consequences of losses and increasing debt? Okay, and is that coming?
Through the Chair. So yes, that's scheduled for the 28th of February, so in a couple of weeks. So.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? No? Yep, make a comment.
Yeah, look, I concur with Peter Fairley-Jones, 1.032 million, and we've gone up to 1.925 million. And I hear what the executive team is discussing, but there needs to be further restraint. I don't see this in this report. I appreciate that there's extenuating circumstances. However, before long we'll be over 2 million. We'll be over 2 million, and that's an unacceptable outcome. and I think that I hear what Sharon Perkins is saying with their executive team and the CEO, or the acting CEO. I think, before long we'll be over 2 million, and that's an unacceptable result, a very unacceptable result. So I look forward to hearing what the strategies and the restraint will be for council operations. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Redmond. Councillor Kosh.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I echo the same concerns, but I think my biggest concern is that some of the elected members aren't actually aware of the seriousness of what's happening, and I look forward to the LGAF coming and actually speaking some hard truths, because I think at the moment I don't want to use the word drunken sailors, but some of the decisions I think are quite inappropriate and not financially sustainable. So I'm hoping that the representative from the LGFA can, just shine a light on what we're doing and how we can actually get this ship, back on the right course. Because at the moment, I think it's not very healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? No. So I think we've noted the comments made. I definitely agree with the comments made, and we'll be interested to see what management does to help, as Sharon said, review, work out where expenditure can be cut, or even consider which projects can, not go ahead, or don't need to go ahead, or change the direction a bit with capital expenditure. Because if you haven't got adequate funding or the financial backing in place, you just can't, as Councillor Kosh said, you can't do everything. So you've got to pick what you need to do, what's essential to the community, and to satisfy the service standards that the constituents expect. Peter?
Chair, would it be useful to incorporate a resolution encouraging council to take a close look at its expenditure and income options to reduce the deficit, to contain the deficit? That might, rather than just leave it open, it might be worth just putting something in the resolution.
Yep, so we put an item 4, propose an item 4 in there to say council and the executive to consider, or... Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think it's a recommendation to council, so I suppose that's...
The executive managers probably need to lead. Or in collaboration with council members. Yes.
Council members just can't complain.
Council to consider strategies to
reduce the deficit during the remainder of this financial year.
Yes. So to consider strategies to this. To reduce the deficit for the remainder of the 2000 years.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the best we can do.
Yeah.
Happy with that? Everyone happy with that? Okay, so we've got an officer's recommendation that we note the mid-year budget review report, which includes the FY24 mid-year budget review with an increase in the operating deficit to 1.926 million, an increase of 1.895 million in capital expenditure, and an increase in capital income received of 1.075 million. A recommendation to the council that the mid-year review as contained in attachment 1 be adopted, and the council consider strategies to reduce the deficit for the remainder of the FY24 financial year. Have I got a mover? Peter, a seconder? Mayor Redmond? All in favour? Carried unanimously. Okay. So we'll move on to 6.2, which is the risk management update. Okay, so Nathan, did you want to speak to this item? If I let you? Okay.
Through the chair, thank you. So as discussed in the report, we've been through a fairly comprehensive process to review and develop a strategic risk register aligned to the community plan. After that, we then went through with exec and then identified the controls for each of those strategic risks. We then went through a survey process where each of those controls were assessed via design, but also the implementing, which gave us an overall rating. And then we conducted workshops to then identify which are the key controls and then identify a collaborative rating for each of those strategic risks, which is the combined effectiveness to basically develop a strategic risk register, also with the key controls. This data has also been uploaded into Control Track, and we'll be starting to go through the corporate risk register and our operational in the same sort of methodology moving forwards.
All right. Yep, Sharon.
And in relation to, which we'll talk about a bit more in the internal audit update, so a lot of these items which are outside appetite will inform the internal audit program and looking at those areas of the business that we need to address from a internal audit and review position over the next few.
Yep, thanks. All right, are there any questions for Nathan? Mayor Redmond?
At what point will we get continuously improving, Nathan?
Yep.
Through the chair, you mean in our control effectiveness in the risk ratings? Yep, so over time, some of the controls we've got were only developed last year in 2023. Those controls are designed very well, but they haven't had time to be implemented. So over time, as those controls will be implemented, that will increase our control effectiveness. That will then can help drop the residue risk. And then over time, as Sharon said, where we've got some of our audits may look at controls that are older or not working, and we can do audits to then assist us in building new controls or reviewing the current controls that are in place to again improve that efficiency. Does that? Yeah.
Sharon, did you want to?
So I suppose just further to add to that, you know, obviously when do we think that? I think your answer is to sit there and say when will we be within risk appetite for all of these controls? I don't think we're in a position to answer, like to give a time frame, but obviously that's why the internal audit program, which is probably trying to not necessarily be defined as an internal audit program, but is that improvement and that process improvement and that efficiency program to actually address these areas, to actually ensure that the things that we're actually doing and the things that we're actually using control are effective, because effectively once some of these things about our asset management plans, while they're designed well, the implementation of them isn't necessarily effective at the moment. So that will actually help, I suppose, once we have that focus and working out where the areas of most benefit are actually going to come, we'll see delivery of the risk will come within appetite, but also we'll see improvement in the delivery, which hopefully will, which should actually go through to, I suppose you'll see it in the budget and what we're actually doing from a delivery of service perspective as well. So I don't think we can give a definitive answer to sit there and say when they're all out. I will say that from an executive management perspective is that we were actually quite tough on ourselves. You know, we were true and honest and from that perspective, and we put it all out there to sit there and say, actually, you know, we know we've got some good things, but we know we've actually got some work to do as well. So I think it's probably, yes, it's confronting, but I think it's from an executive team perspective, we felt comfortable and we know that there's lots of things that need to be done, and we don't necessarily, by doing this assessment, we haven't actually shied away from the fact that there's actually a lot of work that we need to do and a lot of areas that we have to focus on. And our next step, which is basically through the development of the audit plan, is making sure that we've got the focus on the areas where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck up front, and to get those improvements and to bring, and what we would consider the high risk. And even though some of these things are outside appetite, we also believe that there's probably only some of them only need minor things to actually bring them back in, you know. So some of them, like we would sit there and say, you know, if there's like I'll use from an economic development perspective, you know, we think we're outside of the appetite, but it actually won't take much for us to actually bring it in if we actually form a bit, like, you know, improve the relationship and the interaction and that with the Gawler Business Development Group and all that sort of stuff. So some of them will come back in really quickly, but some others will take some time. And again, it's probably the same thing as to sit there and say it's a commitment from the executive team, but it's also obviously some of the decisions that need to be made are made around once it comes back to council. So I suppose it is that also relying on that commitment from the council to actually, I suppose, come along, you know, do the journey together rather than just one side of the parties that need to work together and bring it back.
Question, Christine?
When I read this, because of the number of mismatches between the residual risk and the risk appetite, I was thinking this is not going to be a short-term project to get these back within appetite, and combined with budget pressures, obviously to get some of these back within appetite is going to cost money. So then I was trying to think, well, how would you pick which ones you try and fix first? And one of them, the difference between the risk and the appetite is 2 levels. So I'm looking at the inability to adapt to climate change one, which has the biggest mismatch. And one of the key controls is listed as the biodiversity management plan. But then the paper we just looked at, in the paper, it said that plan was going to be delayed because of budget pressures, although hopefully there's a grant available. So this might be a question I notice as well, is how do you go about getting things back within the risk appetite, considering that you've got the budget pressures, which means you might probably not going to have enough money to fix these things. So how do you go about fixing them?
That's possibly a very big question. That is a very big question, Christine. Oh, look, we're you know, effectively, I think one of the things is to sit there and say that all the executive team is here because we actually understand the importance of it. And as I said, you know, we were probably quite ruthless in being, you know, had that hard, honest conversation amongst ourselves and within ourselves about, you know, there's no point in like glossing over in these things. We know that there's a hard challenge. To answer that question, I think it is that I don't know the answer, but again, I think it is that having having hard questions and hard discussions, I suppose, amongst us at executive level, with like the senior management level, and also with the chamber, with the council members as well. You know, I think it is. There will be some hard discussions that have to happen. You know, there's, you know, just in the budget process, there's going to be those hard discussions, and I think that realistically, that's the starting point, and putting everything out on the table, and saying this is it, and trying to work out what is the great, I suppose, what is the biggest bang for our buck and the value for money that we're actually going to get, and the level of improvements that we'll get straight away, rather than sort of shying away from it and saying it's all too hard, because it is hard. It's going to be hard from that perspective, but I think the first step is actually, I suppose, having those initial hard discussions and not avoiding them, you know, because it is, you know, it is confronting, presenting a report to the audit committee that basically sort of sits there and says that we think where a lot of our areas of the business are operating with outside the risk environment that the council has set for them. And again, it may be the question as to sit there and say maybe we have been a bit too harsh on ourselves, and maybe when, you know, if there is a discussion, you know, and there probably needs to be a discussion with the council as well through workshops or information sessions, and we might find that we're actually harder on ourselves because we've done this self-assessment compared to what the council is on, or that the council can accept. So that's probably one of the other things about the first step is bringing it back to the council, and probably having that open and honest discussion with the council, and going a bit more in-depth discussion with them to sit there and say why we think it's outside of appetite, and making sure that understanding from a council perspective as well is to sit there and say, oh, actually, yeah, it's outside of appetite, but at this point in time, we're prepared to accept that, because this is just initial. This is where we think the starting point is.
Thanks, Sharon. Are there any other questions? Peter? I know you want to.
Tentatively. This stuff is quite difficult, I know. But I look at, you know, the first strategic risk, which is, you know, about community engagement and support of the town of Gawler. And then I look at the, you know, the controls. Well, we've got a digital marketing strategy, which I interpret as a sort of one way. We're telling members what we're doing and so on. And there's a consultation policy, and we've got a community services forum, which maybe I don't quite understand what that is, but maybe that can be explained. But I guess what I'm thinking of is how does the council know that it is got the support? Those things don't really tell me that the community support is there. How do we measure that? How do we know? And I know elected members will have their own sort of networks and so on, where that can be fed in, but sometimes that can be a bit like an echo chamber of certain interest groups and things like that.
That's right.
And maybe there's something needed that allows the council to get objective feedback in terms of the services are being delivered, the level of service, how the place is being run, and all this sort of thing. It's quite complex. It's hard to get a discussion like that going, I guess. But it just seems to me that we don't really have a good handle on measuring and understanding that outside process, and it would be useful to have some sort of objective. So it's really, I guess, more of a comment and maybe something to think about. But it seems to me that, you know, the governing body needs to know this information, and it would be useful to find some way to get it.
I'll make a comment. Community Services Forum was first started by Dr. Bruce Eastick about 30 years ago, and it comprises many different community groups, but also state government agencies, and they work together to, provide certain outcomes for the community. It really is important that we don't just listen to the loud voices, we listen to the other voices. And the other voices are the silent majority. They're the silent majority. They sit back, observe, and they sometimes make comment on Facebook. And there's been quite a number of comments on Facebook recently about council's focus on the community. So I think that it's not just listening to loud voices, it's also listening to those other voices as well.
Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, comment? Yep.
So I just thought of a thing as well. I think just going back to Christine's comment about how we're going to do it, and I think that it's also important, like I think when the risk appetite statements were established, I suppose they were established without the context of the strategic risks and I suppose that assessment of that controls. So I suppose it is that thing about whether, as part of that review process, as to sit there and say maybe it is a revisit of the risk appetite statements, to sit there and say, in the first cut of the round, did we get the levels right as well? So that's probably another thing that probably needs to be done with the council, to sit there and say, okay, well, we've done this assessment of our controls against the risk appetites that the council has come up with or agreed to. Are they, still agreed? Are they still relevant in the context of once we've actually gone through and gone through that process of identifying our strategic risks and our corporate risks as well? So, yeah.
And I think it will take time to gel together. Like, this is a very new document, so as it's used as part of the business and updated, it'll evolve. But there was such a long time there that we didn't even have a risk appetite statement. So now we have one, and we're actually using it against the strategic risks. So I think it's one step at a time. The only question I had was with it's been touched on a couple of times, with the control effectiveness rating and having that consistent across the strategic risks. So I'm assuming if we just say we go the first one, the first risk, lack of community engagement and support with Town of Gawler, you've got the first two key controls being the Community Services Forum term of reference and the digital marketing strategy. They're both effective, so I'm on page 42. And then you go down to the Gawler Business Development Group representation, and that's the number one, that's ineffective. So is that just assessed, that you're saying that the terms of reference is effective because it's written well and it covers off on the risk? Do you get what I mean? Yeah.
Love having strategic risk number one.
Yeah.
Yes, in a way, the terms of reference are written very well.
Yeah.
They're effective. The forum itself is operating extremely well and providing excellent engagement with all of those community services and groups. So there's a lot more detail underneath the effectiveness rating itself. As with the digital marketing strategy, it's created well, it's been embedded, it's recently been updated. So this was assessed on the previous strategy. We've got a new one that was endorsed by council late last calendar year. We have a high engagement with our community through that, and that's measured through our digital marketing asset engagement tools.
Yeah.
With relation to the Gawler Business Development Group, was a comment that Sharon made earlier. We as staff see it as representation ineffective because We have challenges with the relationship with the Gawler Business Development Group, and we need to work through that. There's a new chair of that group that started at the end of last year as well. We're yet to really sit down and work through the new key priorities with the group, upcoming new funding agreements and models that we need to do by the end of this financial year, So we as staff think there's improvement that will be made, so we don't believe the representation that council has and influence council has in that group is effective, so that's why it's ineffective at this point. So there is levels of commentary below that as well.
Yeah, and so like Nathan, have you reviewed sort of the commentary just to make sure that it's consistent across the different strategic risks and the evaluation, etc.?
I've reviewed it. We've also had Bentley's, and that's why we did group workshops that each of the exec managers could peer review what the other exec managers said the design effectiveness was and the operating effectiveness was, just to make sure there was a consistent and agreed value for each of these key controls.
Yep, perfect. No, so that sounds good. Yep, Andrew?
It's probably the first and last thing I'll say tonight, but I'll say something at least. I think Sharon mentioned earlier about some of the risks that we looked at in the context of time and place, and I think probably the Business Development Group's a good example. I met with the Mayor and the new Chair in the last couple of weeks, I guess, talking about, their terms of reference and perhaps a different relationship in the future. I've been working on case studies of other examples of similar entities elsewhere in South Australia, Victoria and so on. So I think that's a conversation we'll need to continue having, but I think there's at least fertile ground to have that resolved. I think there's an acknowledgement by the Chair that they're not there in competition with the RDA, that they need to work in partnership with us. We have some champions, if you like, at the main street, etc., etc. It's also embedded in the urban design framework and what we're going to do there as well, and also council being a bit more proactive in the economic development space by having the people to do that work. So it goes both ways. We have more responsibility there, which is challenging when you've got to manage your budget, as you just said. But I think hopefully in 6 months' time it's a different conversation in terms of risk than where it was perhaps today or 6 months ago.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, are there any other questions or comments? So happy with that. So 6.2, the officer's recommendation is that the Audit and Risk Committee recommends to cancel the Strategic Risk Register, which is contained in Attachment 1, is adopted, and the CEO be authorised to make changes of a minor or technical nature to the Strategic Risk Register adopted by Council. Have I got a mover for that recommendation? Christine, a seconder? Peter, all in favour? Carried unanimously. All right, so now I want to add a motion that report 7.3 be dealt with out of sequence and brought forward to be considered as following item 6.2, so pretty much renaming 7.3 to 6.3 because it requires a decision. It's not an information report, so it's just been slotted in the wrong spot in the agenda. So if we go down to the item formerly known as 7.3. So on page 17. So this is the Treasury Management discussion paper. Sharon, did you want to speak to this one?
So through the Chair, so this is actually as a result of an action item from the last committee meeting. To be honest, I was challenged as to how to present this paper and what areas to cover. So hopefully it's met the brief from that perspective. So realistically, as we discussed at the last meeting, from a financing perspective, the council is actually under some pressure, so it's fast reaching its debt limit. It was out of policy in relation to its mix between debt and fixed, which I think where the impact of that is now being felt with increasing interest costs. So the approach that I took was working out what the purpose of our treasury management should be. And I think the principles of what the treasury management policy has in there is the essence of it is a good practice and a good foundation, but it's a question on what are we doing from an immediate perspective to rebalance the portfolio, which actually has, I suppose, some impacts because, yes, we're hopefully in an environment where there's actually falling cash rates. How long that's going to be, I suppose it depends on what day you listen to the news and what podcasts you listen to and all that sort of stuff, because, a month ago people were saying 12 to 18 months before there will be interest rate cuts. The other day I heard one that they're predicting them in September. Or May, I heard September, and then again I also heard the thing about, in relation to that, we might not be at the peak because of the political unrest and all that sort of stuff as well. So that actually might force the additional inflationary impact, so they might actually do another cash rate increase as well. So it is, what's the answer? I don't know. If I did, I'd be a millionaire and I wouldn't be sitting here. Probably a multi-millionaire, I wouldn't be sitting here. So I probably just took the approach is to sit there and say, how can we fix the, I suppose, or improve our immediate impact, immediate position, without actually having too many, without locking ourselves into not being able to take advantage of the fact that we hope that interest rates are actually reducing down. So obviously there's a number of facilities that are actually available to us that we can actually take advantage of, which are interest only, so that we don't actually have that need to actually find cash to actually make principal repayments. So very similar to the existing facility that we have, but we just have the opportunity to fix the interest rate, so take advantage of some of the lower interest rates at the moment. So that's pretty much the recommendation that I've made, in the sense that what we actually do is convert 50% of our current outstanding loans, which was around about 9 million. I think 9 million is probably realistically our core debt, and I don't see any opportunities where there's going to be windfall gains coming up in the next 6 months. There's not going to be grants that are available to us. The governments aren't going to give us money. We are still facing increasing cost pressures, so I don't think that we're going to be able to generate any surplus cash from within the business. So I think the choice of having around about 9 million and converting that to a fixed interest and taking a bit of an advantage of that will deliver $100,000 savings based on the current interest rates, or 97, I think, around that much, for a 2-year period. And I haven't actually looked, I probably should have looked at the rates this morning to see how much they had actually moved, but at least we'll actually be saving around, 1%, around 1% off our current interest expense based on that $9 million of the debt. So that's pretty much the approach I took in relation to that, because effectively, yes, we do have some issues with making sure that we can manage our debt and minimise the impact of that and try and minimise that risk associated with that. Doesn't fully address it, but I think it's a good step going forward. We'll take questions.
Any questions? Peter?
I understand how difficult it might have been to write, but it's actually quite a good report, I believe. I think the issue has partly been the policy is something of risk management, and it's always attractive to go to the lowest interest rates, whatever they might be, but over time it might be the wrong decision. So and no one knows what's going to happen, so that's why it's a policy to manage the risk of the unknown. And I think what you're proposing here is, in my view, sensible. and it provides a benefit pretty much immediately. So I would be, I think, supporting that. The only thing that I wonder about in terms of the policy is that the policy provides delegation to the CEO for actioning within budget constraints, and it gives the delegation really to the CEO and the Executive Manager of Finance and Corporate. But my question is that a joint decision or is it either or?
Christine? Sorry, Sharon.
I've always taken it as a joint decision, like effectively you need the two to agree within the constraints rather than having a single delegation. I suppose I come from an environment that there's always dual delegation, so that's the intent of it, is that effectively, collectively, there's agreement between the CEO. Yeah, it's just normally, I suppose I just take it as a given that it's always two, rather than having that single delegation to make those decisions. And I think the intent of it was more in the sense that I suppose it's just to allow that responsiveness if there is, I suppose, any further movement in interest rates which we might be able to take advantage of as well, without actually then potentially having coming back to council. If it's still within the mix of the overarching Treasury policy. So, because sometimes from that timing perspective of getting the report back. So.
Thank you. Mayor Redman?
Yes. Will this committee get an update on what you, the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Manager, Finance and Corporate Governance, can enter into a loan agreement for the purposes of restructuring the existing loan mix portfolio to ensure the targets set out in this policy are maintained? Will this committee get an update on what you've done to date?
I think there's actually a requirement in the policy to report and back to the committee. So obviously nothing's been done to date because this position has gone forward. But I think that, and this is where, from a policy perspective, the policy says you need to report when you go out, but there's no flexibility for the administration to actually maintain it and bring it, to maintain it and keep it within policy. So there's an exemption allowed under the existing policy to say you can just report back to me and report back to the committee and say the reason why we're actually going out of policy. But so, and from that perspective, but there's no opportunity to keep it in policy without coming back to the council, I suppose coming back to either the committee or the council.
Yeah, Redman, yeah.
It says here reporting at least once a year. Council's Audit and Risk Committee shall receive a specific report regarding Treasury management performance relative to this policy document. The report shall highlight the following reasons. I think it needs to be every 6 months. I think it needs to be every 6 months, not once a year.
Yep. Sharon, you happy with that?
Yeah, that's fine. I don't have any issues with that from a...
And I agree,
especially considering the position that we're in at this point, and from that perspective of managing, I suppose, managing the portfolio and making sure that I don't have any issues about reporting back to every 6 months. And I just want to reiterate, it's to sit there and say it's not new borrowing, so effectively it's within the existing borrowings and all that sort of stuff as well. And again, and it's not necessarily going outside of any of the standard products that would be used to sit there and say, okay, well, there's from that fixed interest fixed interest tools or products that are actually available.
Yep.
Yes, we change at least 6 months or every 6 months, council's audit shall receive a specific report.
Mm-hmm.
So every 6 months.
Yep.
For the time being.
Councillor Kosh? Go.
I'm just looking on page 7289, and it sort of paints quite a grim scenario there. I'm just wondering, are we at the point now, if any more borrowings, the 6.4 million, do you think that those three issues, those three clauses will be applied to us?
I would sit there and say yes. So literally, you know, if we wanted to increase the debt limit, given the current financial position, I would sit there and say that effectively those conditions would be applied, and it will be effectively the greater emphasis on making sure that you deliver on your long-term financial plan and your asset management plans, and you don't do anything outside of it. You know, so there will be that constraint to sit there and say, if you're considering anything outside of your asset management plan or your long-term financial plan, you'll then probably have to go back to LGFA to sit there and say, is this acceptable? Or from that perspective, because we're doing this project rather than that project. So I would sit there and say, I'd most definitely would be my gut feel. And I think that that's one of the discussion points that will be really emphasised at the information briefing session with council members when LGFA come out, because I know that I've had a few discussions with them as well, and this is where it is critical for them to, I suppose, for the chamber and collectively for the chamber to actually understand what the implications are. And again, it's also the importance of the time and effort and making sure that we get this long-term financial plan right as well, because it will have that critical, it will be a critical document. It won't necessarily just be a document that we're doing because we have to do it because the legislation says. It will be a critical document that effectively will have to drive future budgets as well, you know, from next year and all that sort of stuff. It will be effectively you're setting your budget pretty much and having to live to that going forward for at least until we can actually bring the position back in with constraint. So yeah.
Yep. Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think the delegation's important. I mean, there was some words in the report about what was supposed to have been happening a year or so ago in putting $5 million into fixed, and because interest rates changed a bit at the time, it didn't go ahead, and the consequence has been paid for ever since. So there's speed is of the essence, because at the time I can remember it, that interest rates were on the cusp of changing, and we were considering whether we should be putting the money into fixed at the time, and then it didn't happen because circumstances changed a bit. Probably it would have been good to just have gone ahead and do it anyway, but that didn't happen. The other thing I'm just wondering about the reporting part of it is, do you do monthly finance reports or anything like that to council, or it may be worth every time, because these decisions are not going to be made every week or month even, to make a portion of that report cover changes that have been made, the decisions that have been made at an officer level, so that you're reporting to council on what's happening. And because I think that's the important thing for council to know what's been transpiring. But the Act specifies that there's got to be an annual report after the end of the financial year, and that's a much more rigorous report about how the policy has been applied holistically over the last 12 months. Unless you've got any objections, I would suggest that strategy be reported that on a monthly basis or at the monthly report. It doesn't need to be a major thing then. You're not doing like an annual report every time. Yeah. So if you can convert what I've said into language, that will be good. The other thing I would make a comment about, and I don't know the answer to it, is that the policy states that you've got to have 25% fixed minimum and 30% in variable minimum, and then you can do what you like in the middle of that. But how you measure that is confusing in terms of a problem throughout local government, because I don't think people understand how you measure that at what time, because it changes throughout the year. Is it at the end of the financial year or during the financial year? That's not certain. I don't have the answer to that, but it's a problem in determining whether you put it into fixed or variable. Maybe you need to assume that it's an annual thing, but you've got to have some sort of idea about what the annual amount is going to be at the end of the year to measure against. So, yeah, you might have an answer, Sharon. I don't know.
Through the chair. So I think that obviously, if the financial position was different, when you're actually doing major investment, like major capital works and all that sort of stuff, that might be a trigger point as to sit there and say, okay, well, you use your variable funding mechanisms or your variable facilities to do the construction, and then once the construction has finished of the asset, then you actually determine how much of that variable borrowings that you've actually drawn down, that you would then maybe potentially, if you had the financial capacity, working and doing it into a fixed interest and maybe your traditional credit foncier type loan, because it's associated and link the borrowings associated with the life of the assets and all that sort of stuff, So I think some of those sorts of considerations need to come into account. But obviously we're not in a position to have those discussions yet, because we still don't have that ability to generate enough of that cash or that cash flow within the business to actually make sure that we have freedom to sit there and make those decisions at this point in time. I think the immediate need is to sit there and say, how can we do that budget repair, to sit there and say that we've actually got a combination, and our balance between our cash reserves and our borrowings is balanced right as well. So I think the decision coming until that point is reached is what's interest rates happening, what's our core debt, where's our debt level at, and all that sort of stuff as well, and having potentially shorter in the next few years, fixing it for shorter periods, if that allows, and then having those decisions to be made at that point in time where the refinancing decision is actually made as well. So, I'm recommending 2 years. So then in 2 years' time, we can actually have that refinancing decision to sit there and say, okay, well, where are we at? Do we need to fix as much, or are we in a better position that we can fix more and have different loan facilities as well to spread that interest rate risk as well, and gradually reduce the weighted average cost of the interest expense. So I think that there's probably a lot of decisions and a lot of thinking and pontificating that needs to happen over the next few years in relation to this matter.
Yep. Christine.
couple of comments. First of all, I thought this paper was well written. I understood it and it met the brief. Just a comment around endorsing, fixing roughly 50% of the current debt as in a fixed rate. I think regardless of how the interest rates might have moved today or this week, it should be fixed, because fixing is like an insurance policy and makes budgeting a bit easier because you know exactly how much the interest cost is going to be for, half of your debt. So I think once Audit Committee recommends and hopefully Council agrees, then it should just be fixed regardless of how the rates move, and then you just live with it. As far as reporting goes, some other councils I'm involved with that are also fairly highly geared. We receive a Treasury report quarterly, and one of the issues that we have come across, as Peter's mentioned, is that cash flows fluctuate through the year because of the timing of when you collect the rates, and so it may be that because of that fluctuation, you might go in and out of your percentage, fixed and variable. So we decided that initially when we first did this policy, that it would just be measured on June 30 each year, because basically your rates have come in. But now that we've been doing it for a while, we've asked the staff to provide us just with a monthly graph to show us what the percentages have been over the year, so that we can get some idea of the pattern of the cash flows, so that when we receive the quarterly report, because sometimes, oh no, the percentages aren't within policy, we can understand why, and so possibly we'll refine the policy around seasonal fluctuations so that we are imposing a percentage and say, please keep within the policy, but the policy is written to take into account those fluctuations. So that's a bit more advanced, not on step one, but that's something to think about in the future, so that eventually you can stay within a policy and the policy is written informed around the cash flow. So maybe once the long-term financial plan is done, we might be able to look at it again.
I'll just check the rates, they haven't changed.
All right. Are there any other questions, comments? Nope. Okay, so
So did we want to recommend the auditing report there?
yeah. So if we add
that a quarterly, that a Treasury management report be a standing item, agenda item for all audit and risk committee meetings.
Yep.
Just a comment on that, we can discuss the quarterly one being a much briefer one than the annual one. So the main thing is just that we know has half the debt been fixed, and what are the percentages looking like?
Yep. Okay, so we've got the officer's recommendation that the Audit and Risk Committee receives and notes the Treasury Management discussion paper, endorses the conversion of $9 million floating rate debt to convertible cash advance facility for the period of 2 years to reduce the weighted interest rate from 6.16% to 5.69%. Recommends to Council the adoption of the Treasury Management policies as contained in Attachment 1 and as amended, as we discussed, and recommends the Treasury Management report be a standing item for all Audit and Risk Committee meetings. All right, have I got a mover? Christine, a seconder, Peter, all in favour? Carry unanimously. All right, so if we go to item 7, which is the information reports, and 7.1 being the internal audit work plan update. Who would like to speak? Nathan, would you talk to that?
Thank you, Chair. As presented in this report, Council is still working our way through our action plans that come out of audits. So yeah, we're tracking well on quite a few of those ones. We've also, LGRS undertook a return to work SA observation review of Gawler Council. They've done 50% of councils last year, they're doing the other 50% this year, and that's come about from the Return to Work SA doing a review of local government and the way that they manage their self-insurers licence. From that review, they've identified some key areas that they said councils really need to start looking at, as they're the main driving system for any work health safety management system. So this was conducted late last year, but we only received our final report, I think, on the 15th or 18th of January. We've reviewed it, and on the 15th of this month, we have a plan and program session with the executive management team and also the health safety committee. So this plan and program, we do it every year, and it will develop a 2-year strategic work health safety plan on what we're focusing on over the next 2 years. So the outcome of this report will actually help inform that 2-year plan, as well as other audits that were conducted, from procedure validations, from incidents or work cover claims that have occurred, to the status of our, in general, our WHS system. But looking at it simply, when you look at the maturity level, the way that we develop our plan and program, we've actually got very highly scored. Training systems, we're on par with the sector. Internal work health safety auditing, we are on par with the sector, but it's an area that we need to improve, and that's just resources to actually conduct purely a WHS audit on either hazard management, or it could be PPE, or yeah. So that's something that the plan and program 2-year review session will look at how we can start looking at doing that and resource it. But responsibility and accountability for, yeah, we've got really good scores as well. We're actually ahead of the sector. Cool. And as Sharon said, with the strategic risk register sort of being finalised, this will really enable us to tie down and make a very strong 3-year audit plan. That will be our work over the next sort of couple of weeks to sort of start really tying that, what that plan's going to look like. Thank you. Yeah, any questions?
Are there any questions for Nathan? Councillor Koch?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I just want to talk about training systems. Just some background. My background is partly in adult education. I've been in adult ed for about 30 years. We've got our own business. We publish resources that we market around Australia. When I read this and it says that the assessment evaluations actually just focus on trainee satisfaction and not whether the learning outcomes are met, I'm really concerned. These are the documents that we use, and it's made up of performance criteria, which is what you should be doing, and then we go into the assessments, and that includes performance evidence, knowledge evidence, and assessment conditions. And what that boils down to is, for someone to be competent, they must have knowledge, they must have a behavioural skill, they must be able to actually do something, and they must have a certain level of an attitude, a positive attitude. So, you know, attention to detail, etc. So when I read this, I think I'm very concerned that if the only thing that we do is whether we tick a box to say someone turns up, and we don't actually assess whether the learning outcomes have been achieved, we're just wasting our time and money. So I'd like to know how we're actually going to implement some way of assessing whether training has been effective, because otherwise you're just having people sitting in a room or whatever, and give them a cup of coffee, lunch, and they go home, and that's about it. So yeah, I'm just concerned. I just want to get some comments around that. Thanks.
Yep, Nathan.
Through the chair, thank you. I'm in discussions with LGRS around these comments here. A lot of our training, we actually engage RTOs to deliver this training, whether it be fire extinguisher, first aid training, emergency warden training, or it could be people doing Cert 3s or Cert 4s in civil. They're done through an RTO, so we don't assess the competency of what was delivered because we're getting it through an RTO.
Yeah.
And this is where my argument was to the scheme, is that why would we actually undertake competency assessments when that's what Australian Qualification Training Framework is all for? They do the assessing for us. That's why we engage in RTO. When we look at our internal training from policy procedures, all of our work health safety policy procedures and a large portion of our HR have competency questions. So people can't just rock up, read a PowerPoint, read a procedure, sign it, walk home. We actually ask them competency questions around that. But where their query was snake awareness training. So we actually have a wildlife expert come in, and for 45 minutes to an hour, they show the guys snake behaviour, how they react, what to look out for, what PPE you should be wearing. But what we don't assess is there's no competency to say, can I stick my hand in a hole? We don't assess for that, and that's where they've suggested that maybe we should actually have on our training attendance forms a training outcomes of what do we expect for the worker to have knowledge of after this training, and then in the feedback form, the worker might answer a couple of questions. So it's a very small sample set of where the LGRS was looking at where we do have a gap in the training systems.
Yep, thanks Nathan. Councillor Koch.
Just to follow up, you do the training, do you actually assess whether there's a transfer of learning from the classroom to the workplace and that there's a measurable increase in the person's skill? Because you can have a course and someone could remember the questions or whatever, but are you actually observing a measurable change in behaviour within the workplace? Which is basically a transfer of skills.
So through the chair. So this is where we've been working on verifications of competencies for plant and equipment. That is the biggest ticket where it's high risk. So when people do get trained in a backhoe, when they come out and drive our backhoe, it might be a different size bucket. It could be different controls, and that's where we are looking at, or we are developing VOCs to be able us to actually assess the competency on our piece of plant and equipment. As far as other elements, so say first aid training, or it could be policy procedure training, we've developed Safe Act observations, which is what we've implemented it last year, where we'll actually go out and watch people do a task, whether it be using a front deck lawnmower, it could be using a whippersnipper, or it could be a general inspector issuing out patrolling the roads. They've got a safe operating procedure, which has how they should do the task, what training they need, what controls are in place, or a job safety analysis, which is doing a task. This Safe Act observation allows one or two workers to go out, observe the worker, what they're doing, and make sure what they're doing is in line with the safe operating procedure or the safe work procedure, which is how we protect. So it's almost like a follow-up to make sure they understood what they got told or what they learnt, and they are doing it correctly. So we have started that last year. The verifications of competency for the use of the plant is programmed for this year, is what we're working on, to the point we've actually got one of the staff at the depot that has been undertaking their training and assessor to be able to assess other people on the plant and equipment. I've got my TAE, I've had it for 9-10 years and have been using it, but I'm not familiar and not, I would say, competent to drive a backhoe. That's not my deal. I can help develop the forms and assist the guys to develop them, but as far as signing off a competency, that yes, that's where this other worker will be very valuable.
Yep. Thanks, Nathan. That's good. Any other questions? No? All happy? Cool. All right. So the officer's recommendation is that we receive and note the internal audit work plan update. Mover, Christine, seconder, Peter, same routine. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Oh no. All right. 7.2 is the FY25 annual business plan and budget timetable. Who have we got? Sharon, you want to talk to that?
So this just is being presented to the committee just for your information in relation to the key deliverables. We are having, given the, I suppose, the position of the budget, the emphasis is on probably going to be more so on their current budget because that's where most of the expenditure is. And so we've done a bit of a reshuffle of the program and the focus and the emphasis and where we're actually looking at. So hopefully we do have some in-depth discussions regarding the recurrent budget going forward. Again, as part of last year's program, there is an opportunity for the audit committee to actually provide feedback before it actually goes out to public consultation based on the draft budget that gets, I suppose, endorsed by the council. So pretty much it's hopefully everything goes swimmingly and smooth, and we can probably hopefully get away with the number of workshops and number of information sessions that have been presented.
Thanks, Sharon. Are there any questions or comments on that? No, Peter?
Yes, in the relation to the Audit Risk Committee's role here, we've got a meeting scheduled for 2nd of April, which is in our diaries now, I know. So I was just wondering, we're talking about the budget process and draft business plan, I suppose. It's not before the draft business, I think, or is that the draft business plan at that meeting? No. Yes, so it's a sort of precursor, I suppose. I was just wondering whether we can have some sort of reporting to the audit committee in relation to what the long-term financial plan is showing, or the assumptions that are being built into that. And secondly, the rating strategy and the what's being planned as part of the rating strategy would be useful to have as well. So I was just wondering whether we can make sure that those things are incorporated into the 2nd of April meeting. I also wondered about the schedule of meetings here. At the end of this agenda, we've got another meeting scheduled for the 14th of May. So is that actually going to happen, or is that what was thought would be the case originally?
So that's the ordinary meeting. That will probably happen, but I think there might have to be, I think that there's a clash with, so that might have to be brought back to the 7th of May. But that's just the normal, regular, ordinary audit committee meeting. But I think that the CCS meeting is actually scheduled for the 14th of May, so we'll probably have to bring that back a week. Either. Yep. And I'm more than happy to actually circulate any reports that go to council leading up to that meeting as well, as to where the position is, and obviously any of the workshops that we have, independent members are more than happy. There's one thing that in relation to which I've added in, which I don't think we had last year, is basically an information session with council following your feedback as well. So just rather than having that feedback put back into or your feedback putting straight into a council meeting, I thought it might be beneficial having an information session, potentially, and obviously with representatives of the independent members, to actually maybe attend that meeting as well. So the council members aren't just hearing the message from myself and the fellow council members that are actually on the committee, but they're also hearing any messages that are coming back from the independent members as well. So.
Through Chair, I had a couple of questions. One is if you could explain the participatory budgeting process and how much is involved in that that component, and also what do we determine to be the point at which we're asking council to balance the budget? It says within the term of the council, so that's what, 2026, is it? End of 26? Yep. Okay. All right. Yep. Okay, we can discuss.
So through the chair, in relation to the participatory budgeting, so that was introduced 2 years ago by the council, and the last 2 years as part of the budget process, there's been $40,000 that has been, I suppose, allocated within the new initiatives and capital projects budget. Predominantly, most of the projects that are presented are capital in nature. And then it's basically the project up to a value, an individual project up to a value of 20,000. So it depends on what actually gets nominated. So the process is that the community can nominate a project, and then as part of and through the consultation process, then they vote on which projects that they actually want to deliver through that process. So so it's around $40,000 that was for the last 2 years. I know that last year there was a bit of a push to increase that to $60,000. However, that didn't get through to council because of the financial position of the council last year as well. In relation to, I suppose, the term of putting it back into surplus, I've sort of just built it on last year's recommendation of the Audit Committee to actually return it within 3 years. Obviously, there was a bit of a setback with regard to the rating decision that was made as part of the 23-24 budget process, so that's why I've extended it to by the end of the council term to bring it back to the surplus. So, because
strikes me as just pushing out the day because it's convenient, rather than sticking to a sort of an objective. So, I mean,
and I just figure that this is the current, I suppose, the current council members, giving that, this is their goal to actually, I suppose, end the council term, developing a budget that's reporting a surplus as well. So,
sorry, does that mean so the term ends in November 26? Does that mean the 25-26 budget is in surplus, or is it the 26-27 that's going to be in surplus? Do you know what I mean? It's the 25-26. Okay.
And to make a comment there, that council members need to take responsibility and accountability for the budget and the long-term financial plan and the asset management plans. You can't keep kicking the can down the road and kick it down to the next council term. That's irresponsible. That's quite irresponsible. And we need to take responsibility for the 1.9, whatever it is, deficit, and bring that back to surplus within this council term. And I'm relying on the independent members to provide advice to council in that regard.
All right, Councillor Gosh.
Yeah, I agree with the Mayor. I mean, just one comment I want to say is that I suppose I've been observing a lot of politics over good policy, and I think that needs to change.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yep. Okay. Yep.
Just in relation to your comment, Peter, I think that that's where the emphasis on this budget, you know, if for the 24-25 has to actually form that foundation. So the hard decisions of returning the budget into surplus by the council term, and that's where the emphasis of my comment, which was also included in the council report, is that this 24-25 budget actually forms a foundation. If we don't get this budget right, you know, and make the hard decisions now, that goal or achievement or target of returning to a surplus is actually going to get kicked down the road. So it is, you know, don't think about whether it's the 25-26 year or the 26-27 year. You know, you need to start thinking today in the 24-25 budget year, what do we have to do? What are the changes that we need to make? And we actually need to make good, we're going to have to make hard decisions, but effectively there's going to be, but you're going to have to make those hard decisions today for the long-term benefit of the community. You know, and that's the thing here, is to sit there and say it's a long-term decision that that the council needs to actually make in going through this budget process of 24-25, and you know that really needs to be the emphasis of. You know, you can sort of sit there and say, oh, you know, it's only, but you know, it's only 1%, or it's only this, or it's only, you know, $300,000, but you know that does have massive implications, the cumulative impact on it, on future years, and that ability to actually bring it back into that surplus position. And again, you want to bring it back into a surplus position, but you actually want to start increasing those surpluses as well. You know, and I'm not suggesting that we have super surpluses just for the sake of it, because the only way we actually can reduce that debt is actually generate surpluses, because if you're generating surpluses, you're getting excess cash in the business where we can actually pay down debt. And until you do that, we're just chasing our tails and not getting anywhere.
Yep, Peter.
So, are you suggesting it might be possible to balance the budget in the next this coming up financial year?
I'm not that delusional.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's that hard, to be honest. But you have to accept the hard issues. But you know, you probably don't want to do that close to an election. But I think there needs to be some boundaries to it, it seems to me. So if it's not next year, then the year after, do we want to put a target on it and try as best as possible? You know, things are going to change, of course, but to have that frame the budget and long-term plan to achieve it at the end of the 25-26 financial year. So the 25-26 budget should be balanced.
Peter, am I correct in thinking Gawler's been in this situation before? I mean, you've been on the audit committee for a long time.
Yeah.
And what were some of the levers that were pulled last time to, you know, to claw it back and to get into a stronger financial position? Because this isn't the first time that the council's had to dig deep and come up with solutions.
Yeah, well, from what I understand, I mean, there was a lot of discipline over expenditure, capital projects as well as operating projects, and there must have been some significant increases in rates, you know, maybe over time, but it brought it was quite a serious situation from a, I mean, yeah. But I don't think it was that hugely difficult, was it? I mean, it looks big, but it's when you look at a number of different, So.
Sorry, I
I suppose there's, I think whether yes, they're, responsible budget, but we know that there's a backlog in infrastructure spend and all that sort of stuff. So I suppose that's where some of the challenges that we have as well is to sit there and say, okay, well, responsible capital spend, but there's a minimum level of capital spend and a minimum spend that we actually need to do as well, because effectively that's, again, we can cut our capital expenditure, but what's the cost? What's the long-term cost of cutting that capital expenditure as well, which is always the hard decision. And to answer your question about at what position do we get back into surplus, I suppose from administration's perspective and my perspective, I can only put the numbers out there and I can only influence to a certain degree because I'm not making the decision. It is still at the will of the chamber to actually come crunch time, to actually make those hard decisions and to make those decisions on whether we actually do a higher than normal rate increase, or whether we actually do make some of the decisions about deferring capital expenditure, deferring new projects, and not trying to deliver everything to everyone, and trying to please everyone. Whether it is that planned and structured thing, and that we potentially might have to forego a focus and making sure that we're focusing on the right energies, on the right areas that will actually get those gains and position ourselves better for the future. So I can only influence.
Mayor Edmund.
You actually have more power than you realise, Sharon. It needs to be hard numbers and getting us back to surplus sooner rather than later. We tend to listen to the loudest voices, and we don't listen to those other voices, and they're the ones that we should be listening to. We're listening to the loudest voices, the people that come to the council meeting and yell at council, and that's who we're listening to. We're not listening to the other voices, and they're the ones that pay the rates. They're the ones that pay the rates. So I'd really like us to listen to the other voices rather than the loudest voices, because the loudest voices are they're focused on their immediate vicinity, and they're not thinking. And we represent the whole community, not just the loudest voices, and we're listening to the loudest voices, and that needs to stop.
Yep, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions?
Just to add, I do think there needs to be a recommendation from the staff, supported by the Audit Committee, that the target bit no later than 25-26 budget be balanced. To do anything else is really just continuing a problem that's already been there too long, I suspect. And or you can't stop the council from voting it in another way. That's not your job to do that. But you've at least got to put a recommendation. You've got to argue for the position. That is the responsible thing to do, the correct thing to do. And if they don't, well, things will just get worse and worse. You've already at the limit of borrowings. You talk about a capital, a spend that's necessary to maintain assets and so on. Well, it's going to, that's a capital item, and you're going to have to pay financing costs on it. But you've already got to, pretty high debt level. So your room to manoeuvre is very little, and if you don't increase rates, it's going to just get worse and worse. So or find other ways to save money. That's the only thing, but it certainly needs to, in my recommendation, be by 25-26 budget as a balanced budget.
Yep, thank you. Christine, did you have a comment?
Just a comment. I got a phone call from a staff member of another council this morning who also is hitting their debt limit, and some of the things that they're implementing, and I don't know if the council's agreed or whether the staff decided to do this, because part of the conversation was that there was going to be an information session for council members this afternoon. But basically they've deferred pretty well all of their CapEx expenditure until next financial year, and they've taken credit cards away from all staff so that the staff understand that there needs to be control over expenditure. Now that's caused a bit of a fuss in the community, amongst the staff, all of that, but their result this year will look a lot better than what we thought it would be a month ago.
Yeah.
So that's what they've done.
All right. If there's no more questions or comments, then we've got an officer's recommendation that the Audit and Risk Committee notes the budget timetable for the preparation of the FY25 annual business plan and budget. Did you want to add to that to say something about the return to, so yeah, with the, yeah, and also what would you say with the aim of a balanced budget by FY 25-26? How would you want to word it? Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, so that's page, so yeah, if you go to page 6, if you go to page 69, the goal 5, our leadership goal 5 is a strong and vibrant community, and the last dot point on that page is set a budget that forms a foundation to return the council to an operating surplus or cash positive position with the, we've got within the remaining term of council, and we're going to change it to within 2025-26.
So make sure effectively, so on page 69, these were the annual business plan objectives. So recommend to the council that that objective be adjusted to be an operating surplus or cash positive position by 25-26.
Positive, because that's, if you're talking about cash and you take out depreciation, you'll be, you know, it's cash positive, isn't it? It's, there's no issue there. It's just really, it's really the operating surplus that we're concerned about.
So whether that's the recommendation.
Yeah. But we've been like, sort of, okay, so we've amended it. So we've got the second recommendation that recommends the council that Goal 5, Objective 3, set out in Attachment 1, be modified to set a budget that forms the foundation to return the council to an operating surplus by the FY26 financial year. Yep, sounds good. All right, do I have a mover? Councillor Koch, seconder. Peter, seconding it. All in favour? Carried unanimously. All right. Now, we've done 7.3, so now we're up to 7.4, which is the procurement and local economic benefit. Renee, do you want to talk to that?
Through the chair, thank you. This report outlines the activities undertaken in and since the adoption of the updated procurement policy to improve local economic benefit. I thought it would be important that the report include an analysis of the spend data for the 2023 calendar year, so that the committee could see the categories and spread of the spend by council. The spend analysis for 2023 shows that council has spent nearly $6.3 million with local suppliers across all categories of goods and services, and this represents about 22% of council's spend for goods and services. The report also includes discussion regarding the types of goods and services procured by council in each category, and it outlines activities to be undertaken in the next 12 months, including marketing campaigns to promote opportunities to supply to council, encouraging local suppliers to register their business with vendor panels so that they're visible to council buyers and also to other organisations, which is an important factor. Delivering a doing business with council information session, ongoing staff training, which is really essential when you're trying to, push the procurement objectives within the policy, and to perform a local market analysis just to continue to identify where those local suppliers are available to council. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Renee. Councillor Koch.
Through the chair, thanks for the report. I just want to understand how many of the people providing services are, say, sole operators as compared to, say, a larger business?
Councillor Koch, I'm assuming you mean the local ones?
Yes.
Yeah. I would say, and I haven't done an analysis on this, I'd say that the bigger dollar spend is those larger enterprises, things like Norma, which is locally based. But there are those smaller operators, those small to medium people like Hissy's Electrical and Fluid Plumbing, which are all both, quite small, which have quite a significant spend in those types of services. We Control, I believe he's a sole operator there. And then other smaller companies like Baz's Fencing and the conveyancers and welding providers. So there's a spread.
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure that the smaller operators had an opportunity to actually bid for work with council. That was the main point behind the motion that I requested before. Thank you.
Cool. Are there any other questions, Christine?
Just one question about trends. Just wondering if you're monitoring whether there's any increase in the dollars or the percent of local spend compared to last year, or is there any increase in the local registration with the vendor panel marketplace or the number of tenders submitted? So just looking for a trend.
We're definitely at a point where we can start monitoring now. I think that's definitely the next step. We've got vendor panel as our procurement system up and running, and now the next step is kind of going to the market, encouraging people to register. I think when I came to the committee, in May last year, I gave you an idea of the spend, and it was still around that 22%. So it's not like we've increased or decreased drastically, but yeah, I'm happy to kind of start tracking those spends as I come back to the committee. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I thought it was a good report. I guess the only question that occurred to me was, from what I understand, you've got if you're going through a procurement exercise, you can give a price increase up to 30%, was it, or something like that, 30%, 15, 20%, 30%. So I guess my question is around, do we know how much we're paying extra by having this policy? Do we monitor that in any way?
It's not a price increase, it's just a weighting in the evaluation criteria. So local economic benefit being one of the weighting criteria when you're looking at competitive procurement. So it's mandatory to have that local economic benefit criteria in competitive procurements between 15 and 30% weighting. So it's not the only consideration, and it doesn't necessarily skew the results as much as if you had that kind of weighting around the pricing and advantage. Yeah.
So you're happy that with the evaluation matrix, that if there was a local operator but they were charging twice as much as everyone else, they wouldn't be successful because that wouldn't go through the evaluation matrix?
Yes, I am, definitely, yeah.
This is probably a question for Sharon. Do we need to report this as part of the financial statements, or do we include it in the annual report?
I don't know if there's no mandatory requirement to report it in the annual report from that perspective, and there's no requirement in the financial statements to disclose our local spend. However, there is a procurement component that we do report on in our annual report, and that's one areas that we can actually, I suppose, enhance that level of reporting as to what that distinction between local and our total spend is, and all that sort of stuff as well. So as we've gone through some of the elements of what, how we use the annual report as a reporting tool as well, we've probably looked at, and we've probably made a few enhancements this year. And I think it's just basically going to be, as we go through, what sort of additional information like that we can actually use the annual report and elements of the annual, and because then elements of the annual report then get reported through to publications that we use. We do a spread in the bunyip and all that sort of stuff as well. So I think that there is benefit for us to start looking at, I suppose, the tools or the communication channels that we actually have, and the annual report is one of that things about reporting how much we spend from a local spend and all that sort of stuff as well.
So it's a bit of a leading question, because the state government this year, at June 30, we have to report in our financial statements the percentage of local spend. It's part of our total procurement spend. So I'm just thinking from it would be good, for kind of a good metric to share if we're successful in it, to include in the annual report, just as because that is a state government initiative as well.
I know that there's a couple of initiatives where you can, I suppose, sign up to supplier registers of supply benefits and schemes and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not quite, I don't think the town of Gawler has actually signed up and committed to those, but I think that the general principles of reporting and making sure that we actually have those support mechanisms for those local and small providers, like very similar, like making sure that we're timely on payments and we're paying within terms and all that sort of stuff as well. So those sorts of metrics as well are beneficial to show that we are actually supporting our local economy as well, because we're ensuring, you know, with those small businesses, cash is king to them, and, you know, making sure that we're meeting their payment terms is important to actually make sure, and keeping that stimulus as well. So there's probably a couple of other things that we can actually include and report on, and from that perspective as well, just to demonstrate the extent of the I suppose, support of the local economy, because I think we probably do things and we just do it for granted, but we just don't report on it.
Yeah, I think it'd be a big news story. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's...
Especially if you're tracking the stats anyway, you may as well publicise them. Yep, David.
Through the Chair, if I could just clarify with Sharon's comment, Council is a signatory to the Small Business Council initiative and the Payment Supplier Initiative, which is a national one. So we are signatories to them and we do adhere to those.
Yep, cool, thank you. Is there any other questions or comments? Nope. So that was 7.4. The officer's recommendation is that the Procurement Local Economic Benefit Report be noted. We've got Councillor Koch and seconded by Mayor Redman. All in favour, carried unanimously. All right, then item 8 is item listed for discussion. We have no items listed. Item 9 is questions without notice. There's no questions without notice. And item 10 was motions without notice. So, and I know Councillor Koch wanted to share something.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. At the next council meeting, I'll be giving notice that I'll be stepping down from the Audit Committee. I've really enjoyed being on the committee all these years, but considering that there's only one elected member, you know, on the Audit Committee, I think I need to give that position to one of the other elected members so they can get better insight on what's happening with the Audit and Risk Committee, and also can be involved in discussions. They can come and listen, but it's important that they can be involved in the discussion. So I'll be giving notice at the next council meeting just that I'm standing down, and hopefully you get another person who will be as intent. I really like being on this committee, but it gives someone else an opportunity.
Yep.
Thanks.
And just, thank you for your contribution to this committee, because you have been on the committee for how many? It's a long time.
A long time.
Yeah. But thank you, and, you know, participating and asking the good questions and linking it back to what you know from the council, which is, it's always handy from an independent member point of view to have that skill and insight. So thank you. All right. Okay, yep, cool. So if there's nothing else, we'll close the meeting at 8:58. Look at that, before 9. Cool. And the next ordinary meeting, Sharon's just reminded me that we're going to move that to the next ordinary meeting is the 7th of May, 2024. But then we're also got an invite coming through for the special council, special audit and risk committee meeting.
I'll be an apology for that May meeting, because unfortunately I'm going to be on holidays from the 4th of May to the 30th of May.
Oh, where are you going?
Chile and Argentina.
Wow. It's fine. Whatever.